There's a fish in North America that has its own nickname, not a species name, a reputation. The fish of 10,000 casts. And here's the part that should bother you. The fish swimming right beside it, same lake, same weed bed, same prey, its closest living cousin, will crush your lure on the first cast, and then do it again on the second. Same family, same long torpedo body, same jaw packed with teeth built for exactly one job, ambush. And yet one of these fish floods half the planet, while the other barely clings to a handful of river systems. One attacks on pure reflex, the other follows your lure all the way to the boat, locks its eyes onto it, and turns away. These are the northern pike and the muskellunge, and I'm going to make you a promise right now. By the end of this video, you won't just tell them apart in a heartbeat. You'll understand the 10,000 casts on a level most people who've chased muskies for 20 years have never reached. Because the real answer was never in a tackle box. It's hiding in biology, in a single brilliant science experiment, and in a fishing record so dirty it involves a mobster and a gun. Welcome back to Fishing Lab Explained. Let's get into it. Hang everything on one idea, because this single sentence explains the entire rest of the video. The pike and the muskie are not the same fish at two different sizes. They are two completely different survival strategies wearing nearly identical costumes. The northern pike is a generalist, a jack of all trades that says yes to almost everything. The muskie is a specialist, a rare, fussy predator that says no almost all the time. Generalist versus specialist. That's it. Where they live, how big they get, how they hunt, how you catch them. Every single difference we're about to cover is just that one idea, playing out in a different costume. So let's clear identification fast. But I want you to see it differently than a field guide shows you, because every feature that splits these fish apart is really a fingerprint of that generalist versus specialist divide. Look at the paint first, because the paint never lies. A pike wears light markings on a dark body, pale, bean-shaped bars laid over deep olive and bottle green. A muskie flips it completely, dark markings on a light body, vertical tiger bars, scattered spots, or sometimes almost nothing at all, that eerie silver clear strain that fools even veterans. Say it with me. Light on dark, it's a pike. Dark on light, it's a muskie. The cheek tells the next chapter. A pike's cheek is fully scaled. A muskie is balder. Scales cover only the top half of the cheek and gill plate, leaving the bottom smooth. The tail confirms it. A muskie's tail forks into sharp, knife-like points, while a pike's is soft and rounded at the tips. And if you ever want courtroom-level certainty, flip the fish and count the little pores along the underside of the lower jaw. These aren't random holes. They're part of the lateral line, the pressure-sensing system that lets the fish feel the water around it. A pike carries 5 or fewer per side. A muskie carries 6 to 9. That's a guaranteed, no-guess ID. But here is exactly where most videos get stuck. Right here, in the trivia. The scales, the bars, the pore counts. And honestly, that's the least interesting thing about these two animals. How they look apart is nothing next to how they live apart. So let's put the ruler down and get to the part that actually changes your next trip. Here's the first answer to the 10,000 casts question, and it's the one nobody wants to give because it isn't sexy. A massive reason you boat a dozen pike and one muskie is just arithmetic. There are far, far more pike in the water. The northern pike is the single most widespread freshwater predator in the entire northern hemisphere. It rings the top of the globe, Alaska, across Canada, through the northern states, all the way into Siberia and the canals of Europe. And a pike pulled from a ditch in the Netherlands is the exact same species as one pulled from Manitoba. It shrugs off warm ponds, cold, deep lakes, rivers, even slightly salty coastal water. It breeds early and often, and it stacks into shallow weeds at high density. That is the generalist in a sentence. The muskie is the opposite kind of creature entirely. It's a North American original, native to the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence, the Upper Mississippi, the Ohio Valley, and down the spine of the Appalachians as far south as Georgia. And it lives as a low-density apex predator. Where one weed line might hold a tangle of pike, that entire lake might hold only a scattered handful of muskies. So before we ever talk about mood, or appetite, or attitude, understand this. The muskie is harder to find before it is ever harder to fool. Fewer fish, spread far thinner. That alone earns half the legend. And in the lakes where the two overlap, the muskie runs the neighborhood. They both love the same green cabbage and coontail, but the bigger, territorial muskie claims the prime real estate, the deep weed edges and the open water structure, and shoves the pike off into the leftovers. A small pike does not want to bump into a big muskie, because to a muskie, a pike is just lunch with fins. In fact, a muskie's stomach is so cavernous, it can swallow prey up to roughly 2/3 of its own body length. Stop and picture that. A 40-inch muskie can eat a 25-inch fish whole. These animals are not picking at minnows. They are eating other predators, and that appetite for big, infrequent meals is the first clue to how strange this fish really is. Now, since we're on size, let's settle the bar stool argument, because it comes wrapped in one of the wildest stories in all of fishing. Which one gets bigger? On the pike side, the all-tackle world record is a fish of 55 pounds, 1 ounce, caught in Germany back in 1986, a genuine river monster. But the muskie takes the size crown, and how it took it is completely unhinged. The record the IGFA officially recognizes is a 67.5-pound muskie that Cal Johnson claimed in Wisconsin in 1949. But it's only the record because a bigger one got thrown out. That same year, a man named Lewis Spray reported a muskie of 69 pounds, 11 ounces, and it was disqualified, in part because his fishing partner shot the fish in the head before they wrestled it into the boat. Back then, shooting a giant muskie boatside was a normal way to land one. Today, it shatters the rules. And it gets stranger. A third record stood for 35 years before investigators ruled it a fake. To this day, a group of muskie historians argues that even Cal Johnson's official record is probably bogus. So the next time somebody quotes you the world record muskie like it's settled science, you can just smile, because the honest truth is, nobody actually knows how big the biggest muskie ever really was. The fish of 10,000 casts is also, fittingly, the fish of 1,000 lies. But none of that, not the density, not the size, is the real heart of the 10,000 casts. The real answer is behavior, and this is where the muskie stops being a big pike and becomes a different animal altogether. The common wisdom is right as far as it goes. Pike are opportunists, muskies are picky. A pike will detonate on a lure it has zero intention of eating, purely on reflex. A muskie evaluates, it follows, it calculates. A pike that chases your lure to the boat will usually eat it on the very next cast. But a muskie that follows and turns away might not strike again for a week. Everyone who's fished both knows this in their gut. But why? What does picky actually mean inside the fish's skull? For almost all of fishing history, that was just folklore, a feeling passed around campfires, and then somebody finally dragged that folklore into a laboratory. This is the single most revealing piece of muskie science of the last decade. Researchers at the University of Illinois, graduate student John Bieber, Michael Louison, and Professor Corey Susky set out to crack the mystery head-on. The state's Natural Resources Agency had been netting one particular lake, kept hauling up piles of muskies, and could not figure out why anglers barely caught any. So they loaned the lab 68 muskies. Every single fish got a microchip and an individual personality test, because, as Susky put it, fish genuinely have personalities, the same way dogs and people do. They scored each one on 4 traits: how active it was, how aggressive, how bold, and how much it loved to explore. Then they released all 68 into a pond stuffed with food, and they fished it. Every single day, for 35 straight days, every lure, every angle, every hour of daylight. Out of 68 muskies, in over a month of relentless daily fishing, how many do you think they landed? 7. They recreated the fish of 10,000 casts in a backyard pond, on purpose. But the jaw-dropper wasn't the number. It was which 7. The fish that got caught were the bigger ones, and the less aggressive ones, and the less exploratory ones. The calm, lazy homebodies that mostly sat still. Read that again, because it is completely backwards from what every angler would guess. The hyper-aggressive, restless fish, the ones you'd swear would be easiest to provoke, those were the fish they couldn't catch. And when the team measured the fish's metabolism, the internal engine, how fast each fish burns energy, there was no difference at all between the caught and the uncaught. The thing that decided whether a muskie ended up on a hook was not its hunger and not its energy. It was its personality. And once you sit with it, it makes perfect sense. Because reaction strikes exist. If hunger were truly the lock on a fish's mouth, then nothing you threw would ever work, on either species. A pike proves that every time it crushes a flashing spoon on a completely full stomach. The muskie isn't refusing your lure because it just ate. It's refusing because of who it is. And that famous figure eight follow, the muskie ghosting your bait at the boat, just staring, that's not a shy fish. That is you watching a cold, calculating predator run the math in real time on whether you are worth the calories. All right, theory's done. Let's turn all of this into fish in the net and watch how the gear splits cleanly right down that generalist specialist line. Start with the pike, because the pike rewards the simplest, most disrespected lure in the entire box, and I will defend it to my last breath, the casting spoon. Here's a question worth chewing on. Why does a dumb, bent piece of painted brass still outfish a $40, photorealistic, multi-jointed swimbait? Here's the part that genuinely changed how I think about lures. Because the spoon talks to a sense that is older than eyesight. When you drag a heavy spoon through the water, it doesn't just flash, it shoves water, throwing off a slow, chaotic, low-frequency thump. And the pike's lateral line, that exact row of pores we counted under its jaw, running all the way down its flank, is tuned almost perfectly to those low-frequency waves. To the fish, in the dark, through thick weed, that wobble feels like a wounded baitfish struggling, long before the pike ever lays eyes on it. The spoon isn't fooling the eye, it's fooling the lateral line. And this is the hill I'll die on. Most anglers obsess over lure color, but for a reaction predator like a pike, I'd argue color is one of the least important variables on the lure, and the vibration it throws is one of the most. Match the thump before you ever worry about the paint. And the king of these spoons, the Eppinger Dardevle, carries a backstory almost no angler has heard. It began in 1906, when a Detroit taxidermist named Lou Eppinger hammered out a thick slab of brass, heavier in the middle, thinner at the edges, specifically so he could finally cast a long way with the brand new bait casting reels of his day. That weird taper was never decoration. It's the precise geometry that gives the spoon its hunting wobble without spinning out and twisting your line into a bird's nest. He named it the Osprey, then renamed it in 1918 after the U.S. Marines the enemy had nicknamed devil dogs in the First World War, and spelled it strangely, Dardevle, to slip past the censors who refused to print the word devil on a package. 100-plus-year-old engineering, and nobody has improved on it since. One honest note on the science, that old rule, silver on bright days, copper on cloudy ones, isn't a law of physics, it's a decent rule of thumb about contrast and reflectance. Use it as a starting point, not gospel. And whatever spoon you throw, do the fish a favor. Swap the treble for a single hook. It slides through weeds cleaner, buries deeper, and releases the fish faster. And pair it with a wire leader, every single time, because a pike's teeth slice clean through regular line in one bite. That part is genuinely not optional. The muskie demands the exact opposite of simple. It demands a discipline. Heavy rods, thick braid, 10-inch lures, and one technique that is truly non-negotiable, the figure eight. Because the muskie is that calculating evaluator the science just revealed, it will follow your lure to the boat constantly. So at the end of every cast, you plunge the rod tip down into the water and sweep the lure through big, smooth, continuous turns, literally drawing a wide figure eight beside the boat to keep it moving and keep that fish deciding. Ask serious muskie hunters how many of their fish eat right at the boat instead of out on the cast, and a lot of them will tell you it's a huge share, by some estimates getting close to half. That's angler experience, not a lab figure, but every guide on these waters treats it as gospel, and so should you. So why does drawing a figure eight trigger a strike that a straight retrieve never could? 3 things fire at once. 1. Sudden direction change. Real prey does not swim in a calm straight line once it knows it's being hunted. It panics and cuts hard to the side, and that turn screams, escaping meal. 2. Acceleration. You speed the lure up into the turn, and a fleeing, accelerating target is a hardwired strike trigger. 3. The side profile. On the outside of the turn, you swing the lure's full broadside into view, and that matters enormously, because muskies and pike attack from the side. They T-bone their prey to clamp it across the body, then turn it to swallow it head first. And the number one way people blow it? The panic lift, letting the lure drift up toward the surface as it nears the boat. To a muskie, a rising lure is an escaping lure, and it quits on the spot. So force that rod tip down and hold the depth. Keep your turns wide, too. You are trying to turn a 4-foot stiff-bodied submarine, and a big muskie physically cannot pivot on a dime. Tight turns lose the fish, every time. And brace yourself for the violence. If a 40-pound fish detonates on a short line right at the boat, with your reel locked solid, something is going to give. Your rod, your line, or the hooks tearing free. A lot of veterans run the 8 with a thumb on a free-spooling reel, controlling tension by hand, so that when the fish hits, the thumb slips, the line peels, and that shock gets absorbed into a clean hookup instead of a snapped rod. So pull it all together, because here's what I want you to actually walk away with. The pike and the muskie wear the same uniform, but they were never the same fish. The pike is the generalist, abundant, opportunistic, beatable with a slab of brass and a willingness to cover water. So fish it like a generalist, cover ground, trust the vibration, and let its aggression and its numbers work for you. The muskie is the specialist, rare, positional, and selective by personality. So fish it like a specialist, hunt specific spots, finish every cast with a figure 8, and treat each follow as a fish you're one mistake away from losing. And that word, selective by personality, drags us back to that experiment one last time, because it leaves behind something genuinely unsettling. If the catchable muskies are a specific type, the bigger, calmer fish, and if personality gets passed down from parent to offspring, then think about what a century of fishing quietly did. For generations, anglers kept the muskies they caught. Which muskies got caught? The catchable ones. And we hung them on the wall. Without ever meaning to, we may have been running a slow, accidental breeding program in reverse, stripping the catchable fish out of the gene pool and leaving the wariest, most uncatchable individuals to do all the spawning. The fish didn't just happen to get harder to catch. Generation by generation, we may have made them that way. And remember, a 50-inch muskie can be 15 to 20 years old. You may be holding a fish older than the teenager netting it. That is decades of growth you cannot replace in a single season. Which flips catch and release from a nice idea into pure self-interest. Every legal muskie you slide back into the water isn't just a fish that survives. It might be the exact fish carrying the genes that keep this species catchable for your kids. So leave the fish in the water while you work the hooks free. Crimp on a heavy leader so you never lose one trailing line in a lure. Swap to single hooks and let it go. Understanding the biology doesn't just make you better at catching these two fish. It makes you the reason there are still fish here to catch. That's the lab for today. If this changed the way you see two fish you thought you already understood, hit subscribe, drop your biggest pike or muskie story down in the comments, and I'll see you next time on Fishing Lab Explained.